Your Highness Princess Mashael Al-Shalan, thank you for joining us. Your Highness Princess Noura bint Turki Al-Saud, thank you for joining us, Your Highness. Founding partners at Eon Collective, real pleasure for you to join us. Princess Noura, if I could start with you, what's your role and mission here at the Future Minerals Forum? And in general, if you would, could you put the role of sustainability and development advisors at this forum into perspective, what you're here to add?
So I'll start with our mission as an institution, and honestly as individuals and just human beings. We see development really having to focus on the individual themselves and communities and societies. So how do you put humans at the forefront of development and well-being? And that in of itself trickles into the conversation around mining and development, because it's important to think about how communities are developing and what are you giving back to communities and how are you giving the individuals the tools to be able to sustain themselves, as opposed to having some foreign entity or an external factor support them for long term. And that in of itself is a fundamental of social sustainability, right? And our role here and I would say our participation at the Future Minerals Forum is critical because minerals are going to take center stage in this whole conversation around sustainability, climate change, and the energy transition, right? And for more than a decade, Mashael and I have been working at the intersection of climate and energy, focusing on working on policy design, but also working with communities on the ground, and also working on the dialogue side when it comes to international diplomacy and cooperation. And we're seeing how renewables and the demand for minerals in the race to deploy more and more renewables is increasing. And therefore, the mineral sector and the mining sector is going to be more and more responsible and will have to be more responsible and play a more important role. They know that. They know that the eyes are going to be on them. But it's a very important conversation discussion, because the more conversations happen from the early onset and the more you bring players into the conversation, the better it is for the development of the sector in a sustainable way, because there is a chance to do it right. We've seen how other extractive sectors have maybe lagged behind when it comes to the conversation around sustainability, but more importantly, well-being and economic development and ecological footprint. But for the mining industry, yes, they have their legacy, but at the same time, they're looking into a boom. They're coming into a boom that is, no one could have expected if we're looking at what the industry was like 15 years ago. So It is an opportunity for them to start right and really transform how the industry has been operating.
Thank you very much. And part of starting right and being effective and being responsible is making the sector more inclusive. And the minerals, let's say space, industry is not known for being particularly inclusive when it comes to at least gender. So, Your Highness, Princess Mashael, if you could talk to us about how you see the industry becoming more conclusive. What can it do to become, A, more attractive to women, but B, also more prepared to accept them?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. I was chatting with, this is the beauty of being in conferences like these, is you tend to sit among multitudes of different ministers, each coming with their own country's priorities and how they're looking at the development of their own sectors. Especially for the African continent, some countries are a little bit behind others, but they're all trying to catch up when it comes to meeting the demand, let's say, that's necessitated by our climate realities. If we're really looking, if I may, to take a few steps back, what are we really trying to achieve with these minerals? At its simplest form, try to achieve a very just and inclusive energy transition, try to ensure that there's consistency in how our economies are developing, and try to ensure that while we're doing all of this, that we're not repeating the mistakes of the past. This is a part, let's say, that some people might not have been addressing to date. So particularly when it comes to the role of women within that sector, I think it's not only a question of inclusivity, it's what additional lens can they be bringing into this kind of sector, and one that might require a little bit more maybe collaboration because of today's new realities, less competition, requires a little bit more of attention towards sustainability, and not just at the superficial levels, not solely from the environmental perspective, but equally from the social dynamics and the socioeconomic perspective. How do you ensure that these sectors are becoming spaces where women, once they're integrated into them, are clean, are safe, are just in terms of the payoffs that they're providing to the ecosystems and economies around them. So I think, if I may, from that sense, draw a little bit of a parallel to where things stand for different sectors in Saudi Arabia today. I personally come, as my colleague Noura, from a climate and energy background, and I've been more recently mandated to help develop and establish a Women in Energy NGO. The reason why we were mandated in doing that by the women, by the way, within the ecosystem, it was not a top-down kind of approach, is them seeing that they were not recognizing enough of their counterparts within the system itself. So yes, within the ministries, but not within the ecosystem at large. I think the same applies to the mining as an industry. For the energy sector, we saw, and that's where we got a bit of the numbers, let's say, around 5% integration of women into the workforce compared 5%, which is menial, right? If you track it especially and compare it to the progress that Saudi Arabia was able to establish over the past few years, let's say, which is now tracking, I think, around 37%. We're almost at the stage where we're saying, in spite of our Vision 2030 ambitious goals, we're ready to push that goal and boundary further. So now we're talking about a sector where integration of women might not exist in a lot of geographies. In places that might be the poorest and probably the sulliest and most dirty, maybe women are leading in the forefront of trying to achieve some kind of stability for their own families. So when we're thinking about this from a systematic lens, we must think of what might apply to Saudi Arabia. But to the point that we're doing with this Future Minerals Forum today, and what we're reminded of, is that no one country can do it on its own. It has to be a regional, a super region kind of approach to attacking this project and this progress, and specifically from an integration of those that might have been left behind in this process, women included in this case.
And you're participating in a panel discussion here at FMF on these centers of excellence as, I guess, mechanisms to make the critical or the mineral space more inclusive. Is that the right way to go? Is that going to help solve the problem?
I think absolutely so. If we're honest about what does it mean for us to establish a center of excellence, I think the prowess that allowed us to establish them in the past was more technical. Right? When we're thinking about the problems that we're trying to face today, that bracket is all of a sudden magnified, right? So you're not only looking at the traditional engineering disciplines that need to be acquired, or the geological in this case, or et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Now comes into fore the need to have the social sciences, the need to have an ability to understand the basics of climate dynamics, the need to have a deep understanding of our Earth's resources and how can we gather them in a way that's consistent and sustainable. And that's in the early stages of the development, let alone at the very late stages of decommissioning of systems, of what are we leaving in our wake? Is it holes in the ground? Or are we trying to leave something that's a bit more progressive, that requires an amplitude of different skill sets, all combined under one roof in this case?
I just want to jump in and you clearly highlighted the complexity of the issue, because what we're talking about today is a multifaceted challenge that requires all of these different know-hows, and you need to think in systems as opposed to a linear way, right? Or a specific way in engineering or whatnot. But I want to go back to the issue that you pointed about women in the industry. And I think from observations and from what I see, you see women on the field, right? Either maybe not necessarily mining, but you see them in oil and gas fields, you see them working in rigs, you see them there. Even here in the kingdom, if you go to the Aramco rigs and plants, you see women there. And yes, they're not enough, but there's no limitation. I think the understanding or the belief that this is not a place for women is just flawed, right? And it's incorrect because they're already there. It's just society in a way has created barriers for them to entry. And so, and if you were not someone who is passionate about, engineering, about chemical engineering or any other form of petroleum engineering, then you wouldn't enter the sector, right? If your parent or your sibling or someone was not part of that ecosystem, it would be harder for you to enter. So creating the right infrastructure that allows women to explore the sector first and foremost, and then give them access to try it out, will in of itself allow for more women to join the workforce. Because we've seen what happened with the Ministry of Energy. Overnight, the ministry has transformed, with a big proportion of their workforce being women, brilliant women, there because of merit, not just to tick a box or to tick, a KPI of how many women you're employing. And they're all fantastic. And so the capacities are there, the passion is there, but you just need more encouragement. And I think widening that ecosystem, particularly if we're thinking about how people want to live their lives, right, and the quality of lives. People have to, and this doesn't just go for women, by the way. Even men, if they're attending to their families, they want to spend quality time with their families. Men, just as women, are more and more looking at having this work-life balance, right? And I think with how technology has evolved over the years, it's allowing for, a less structured way of working, but not reducing the value that they bring in. So I think the dynamics are changing. They certainly are changing,
Because if you think of the minerals industry, it keeps running into problems in terms of stakeholder relations, really, right? In terms of, relations with governments and relations with communities. And you just wonder if it was a little bit more inclusive, if that problem would be easier to solve.
Absolutely, and I think it should stem from learning from our past mistakes, right?
Yeah.
So I heard one of our speakers today that says that there's a big focus on burgeoning companies in this super region, so-called, Central Asia, Africa, and the Middle East, Saudi Arabia being party to it. But there's a lot of talk around NIMBY, or not in my backyard, when it comes to Europe, when it comes to the United States, primarily because they've seen an older version of mining and what it stood for. It meant mountains that were once your backyard, sort of emancipating and becoming one with the earth.
Yeah.
It was fumes that you were being dumped with. It was lung disease with coal. So this kind of long history becomes something that's difficult for one to choose to go into. And if we're thinking of the youth as well, we've been thinking about the petroleum engineering organizations, and maybe in parallel as well for the minerals. I would assume that it would be skewing more old compared to other more attractive sectors, because these are seen as the polluters. And when it comes to the critical minerals itself, there are saviors and potential source of a headache, right? So there needs to be a bit of an evolution in how we're approaching this, and maybe also choosing what types of jobs do we want to relegate to humans altogether, and what side of the system do we want to automate and keep for more resilient, let's say, species, in this case robotics, to take on instead of humans.
And Your Highness Princess Noura, you're taking part in a panel called Reality Check on the Energy Transition, Gradual and Managed. And there's a question mark there. So that's really the controversy, isn't it? No one wants a chaotic transition, but climate change is, as we know, already here, right? So how long do we have to transition to it? How gradual can that transition really be? So how do you balance this urgency for change with a desire to achieve that change and mitigate climate change? How do you do that in a balanced way? How do you square that circle?
So the transition is definitely going to be a messy one. The important thing, and I think the first thing to manage, is how do you manage the impact on societies and the individual, right? We've seen how change in commodities, how it affected communities, right? We've seen the energy crisis in Europe and how that affected prices, and how the impacts there trickled down into the rest of the globe, particularly the global south. So I think the biggest component here when we're thinking about managing the transition is thinking about its impact on society, but at the same time, this gradual management and this gradual transformation to more sustainable, or even more importantly, a better word to use is a cleaner future and cleaner technologies. Because
Yeah.
what are we talking? Even when we're talking about mining, you're going to emit. Yes, it emits less than your existing energy infrastructure, but there's still a lot of environmental impact
Yeah.
in the mining industry itself and everything from the entire value chain, right? So I think that is something that must be managed. In addition to balancing, as you gradually decline and you gradually reduce your reliance on fossil fuels, how do you scale up the other alternative sources of energy, renewables and what sort? And I think there is the biggest challenge, because we do have scenarios, we do have forecasts, but again, they serve a purpose to help guide, but they're not the all and be all, right? We know in the end by 2050, 2100 more or less where we'll be, but the road there is going to be bumpy. It's not going to be linear. You may have a boom in deployment, this year. It may go down next year in terms of how much capacities are being installed. So you kind of need to manage and balance that really well and not remove something before the alternative is ready. Because if you do that, then you risk damaging societies, right? And not to mention adding the environmental impact and the environmental component over that. That adds another layer of complexity, right? Because there's this conversation about we need to move fast, right? But how fast can we move while taking into considerations all of these other challenges, like you mentioned, the environmental challenges and the social challenges that come along with it? And I think there's no harm in pausing for a while and thinking about consolidating some of the regulations that are out there, reviewing some of the approaches, the best practices and the not so good practices, and why they emerge in that way, and in order to put the right policies and for governments to, governments and the industry work together to put the right structures to allow for this transition to happen in the least, I would say, disruptive way to society.
If I may just add one more angle to that, I think pausing, it might not have been the word that you were seeking to say, maybe is somewhere along the line, not be afraid of revisiting what those rules and regulations are, because sometimes you cannot stop a bullet train, right?
Yeah.
And you risk actually by attempting to stop it is that the worst players will be moving on ahead, as opposed to those that are considerate enough to say, well, hang on a minute, let's look at how we're doing things and if it's appropriate or not.
Yeah.
I think what's also important to remember within this bigger context, when we say words like transition, it almost has a semblance of a very smooth exercise of dialing things up and dialing things down, and we're thinking in reality it's a full transformation of systems and every component that goes into it. We're also talking about things that are nice to talk about, like the circular economy, for example, recycling a lot of our inputs.
Yeah.
Well, great, but point me to one circular economy globally, just one. Non-existent. So these are a lot of frontier areas that we're trying to break.
Yeah.
Does not mean that we should not attempt, but we should have a healthy dose of humility. Track B, track C, track D, endless. We have a lot of alphabets to sort of play around with to make sure that we're translating a lot of this bold, one-word, cool slides into action. And that's when you roll up your sleeves and get to the nitty-gritty of it is when a lot of these gaps start emerging that we will start to need to fill in a way that's consistent with our own values and what we want to see in the future.
I was talking to the Minister for Mining of Ghana yesterday here at FMF, and he said, look, ESG important, but more important than any of that, at least his opinion, was keeping more of the value chain in countries like Ghana and developing prosperity. What do you say to that?
I fully agree with that. I mean, for developing countries and African countries where the majority of minerals are currently concentrated, the minerals are their resources, but if they can't do anything with their minerals and they can't create the value or extract that value, then what is the point of having it? And I think historically we've seen this extractive nature of developed nations extracting and taking on all of the benefits without giving back to those communities, without ensuring that they're transferring technologies, transferring capacities. And I think this is back to our earlier point. There's opportunity to reimagine the industry in a way where it's an extractive industry that gives back to communities as opposed to, and countries, as opposed to one that extracts and takes away.
Yeah, but also what kind of value are you trying to leave in your wake? Is it just about processing? To what extent are you pushing this development?
Yeah.
If you're going to get to more advanced areas, these are spaces where you're going to have to start to talk about access to energy, right? Where are you getting all of your energy from? Like these become more and more difficult conversations to have around what needs to happen within the space overall and do it in a way that's a bit more comprehensive. And honestly, where I feel that there needs to be more attention posed primarily on the mining industry is that the metrics that we've developed for other sectors are not fit for purpose. So ESG will look at the functionality of a company, but it will not be looking at where it matters, which is the mine, right? Like you could be doing the worst operations as long as you can mitigate it and balance it on some other side of the equation, then you're good to go. Or maybe that mine is not owned by you as a company, but owned by a subsidiary. So
Sure.
you might look good. You know, we've seen this with Shell, for example, talking about another resource, petroleum in Canada, where they've decided we're not going to go into these wells or these production sites because they're too dirty. So we're going to leave it, right? They leave the operation, and who swoops in? Smaller companies that do not have the means or the standards of operations of the shells to operate in that. So at the end of the day, where it matters, be it on the communities that are surrounding it or be it on our planet, like in the case of climate, you know, we're worse off than we were better off. So we have to think of what we're trying to measure and how we're aiming to not just have nice papers, but, you know, translate it in a way that's felt concretely on it.
And I think this goes back to the point of what you mentioned of the smaller companies, right? With the mining industry, you have a parallel, right, with the juniors who are coming in, or companies that are smaller and don't have the capital flow or the cash flow in order to develop in a way that is, quote unquote, more sustainable or more has less of an environmental impact and a social impact. And I think this is where, to my earlier point, is where revisiting some of the standards, looking at how you can transfer the knowledge, how can you reduce the barriers to entry? Because if you are putting all of these barriers and you're creating all of these structures and limitations to companies that are going to get into it, they're going to end up doing something in an inefficient manner, in a way that's destructive. You know, that's if they're allowed to develop. And if they're not allowed, then you're stuck in a situation where you have a shortage.
Yeah.
So if you really want to address the problem, you really have to have these structures that reduces the barrier to entry to some of these smaller companies and those with less cash flow, but find ways of supporting them in a way where, you know, as they're building, as they're developing, you are ensuring that the capacities are there that are aligned with the requirements, right? And to your point, ESG can be arbitrary. And people can navigate. It's just about how you balance you look at your balance sheet and try to balance for an outcome to look nice.
Yeah.
But how do you make it more fit for purpose?
If you just transpose that word company with country, and you think about Saudi Arabia as a wealthy country, United States, wealthy country, very different kind of situation. And one wonders when it comes to sustainability and facilitating sustainable practices, it's one thing if you have loads of capital and another if you're doing it on a shoestring budget.
I think that's where His Royal Highness Prince Abdulaziz bin Salman said it so aptly today when we're talking about our climate goals and ambitions, right? When we're talking about this energy transition that we're going through, that the mining sector is supposed to fuel. To what end, right?
Yeah.
The spirit of the Paris Agreement was to ensure that all countries have differentiated pathways to reach that intended goal and target. And by the way, it was not reached in a haphazard manner. It's because each countries have different sets of endowments, different priorities that would enable them to get from point A to point B, right? In the case of the United States, for example, we had the IRA that was very intelligently done. I think the first smart thing that the US did was to call it the Inflation Reduction Act,
Sure.
which is one of the most boring names I think I've come across. So no more green deals, nothing that's flashy. It's something that looks at inflation.
Yeah.
And when they were doing it, they tried to ensure that you're putting on all of the stakeholders, in spite of the Republicans not voting for it, but they had their voices embedded within it so that all of their constituents are benefiting from it.
Yeah, it's very popular.
Very popular because it's smart, because it ensures stickiness. But at the same time, it was looking a little bit inward. So when you're thinking about what resources are you pursuing, right? What are you tapping into and how are you developing it? The same for a parallel track, let's say, in the EU with the Green Deal and doing a lot of this transfer of knowledge and collaboration with African nations to try and get the inputs that are needed to help them achieve their intended goals and targets. So we cannot operate in vacuum on our own. The priorities might not always be, in spite of its superficiality, solely focused on sustainability. There are very strong elements that sometimes are contradicting when it comes to the geopolitics, when it comes to the economic, that should not be underscored, right? So you have to take a more comprehensive look at how you title this word sustainability that goes beyond just a focus that's super narrow on the environmental side, something that's a bit more broad and comprehensive. And key to it is an understanding of the geopolitics. To your point, when you're going up to this level of countries, countries in a lot of cases don't necessarily behave as a well-behaved child, maybe sometimes, right?
Yeah.
Like there are some inherent grievances that they might have centuries ago that might reemerge when it comes to what needs to be done, as opposed to translated into its nitty-gritty or the scientific or the Excel sheet of, what fits in and how can we make sure that everyone is better off. It becomes more of how can I appease some of my grievances or my constituencies or the population that I'm trying to serve. So we need to evolve, I think, the conversation to a space that's a bit more, not necessarily globalist in its view, but collaborative. And when we're saying the word collaboration, understand what are the underlying brickwork that need to rebuild this trust so that we can work in a system that's a little smoother than, what we're left with today.
I think this goes back to this whole conversation on a super region, right? I think what do you need to build trust, right? You need to show commitment, you need policy continuity, you need to deliver on what you've promised, right? And if we look at the parallel with climate negotiations, none of these have been achieved, right? And I think they're talking about, what we've been hearing all the ministers and all the participants and industry leaders talking about here, is their commitment to actually deliver on some of these promises. And here's where the test will be, right?
Yeah.
And hopefully through this super region, again, if in a fragmented world, in the fragmented world that we live in today, this is an opportunity to really rebuild trust. And it could start from this sector and then trickle into other sectors and hopefully become a catalyst for a greater movement.
And Your Highness Princess Noura, since you mentioned this conference, last question, what do you make of the Future Minerals Forum?
I think it's fantastic. This is the first time for me to attend. I've heard how it started as an intimate gathering. Last year was about 3,000 and this year is about 16. So I think it's fascinating. I think it's important. I hope next year maybe more people involved in the climate conversation will be involved because this is, again, as I said, the mining will become issue and industry will come center stage and under the spotlight.
Yeah, sure.
So the more you have people from the climate community, the more the industry understands the challenges that the climate is facing, the better it is for them. Because one of the biggest problems that we've seen when it comes to the climate negotiation and the energy transition is that though the energy experts haven't been talking to the climate experts, right? And in order to address the climate issue in a way that is realistic and pragmatic, you need to understand energy systems and energy structures, right? And if you have that gap, then you're constantly going to work in a divergent way, and 30 years later, you haven't achieved much, right? So I think this is an opportunity to have the sector communicate and understand the challenges that surround climate and climate change to become more sustainable and more, maybe not, I actually don't really like the word sustainable because in a lot of the cases we are not here to sustain, we are actually here to rebuild and regenerate and then sustain.
Yeah.
So I think that's a better word, but to be more, exactly, for the industry to be more responsible and more attuned to the needs, to be more sensitive to the process.
Your Highnesses, Princess Noura, Princess Mashael, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.